The name Dracula was taught to us through horror movies. However, his true story is much more terrifying. He wasn't just a bloodthirsty legend. He was one of the most monstrous rulers of his era, who tortured thousands of people by impaling them, creating a literal forest of the dead. And perhaps most strikingly, this man was the childhood friend of Mehmed the Conqueror. Born in Wallachia in 1431, Vlad was introduced to the cruel face of politics at a young age. His father was a voivode loyal to the Ottomans. As a sign of his loyalty, he sent Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, to the Ottoman court as hostages. This was no imprisonment with chains in a dungeon. Sultan Mehmed II didn't distinguish between the two boys and his own son. They were given a palace education and were allowed to study with the best teachers. They grew up alongside Prince Mehmed, who would later become Mehmed the Conqueror. They ate at the same table and played the same games. Some historians even say they were blood brothers. In other words, these three boys had once sworn an oath of friendship. But years later, one of these friends would become one of history's greatest sultans, while the other would become one of its most bloodthirsty rulers. In 1447, Wallachia fell into turmoil. The Hungarians killed Vlad's father and mother and put a pro-Hungarian voivode on the throne. The Ottomans supported the young Vlad and restored him to the throne. But Vlad was still very young, and when the Ottoman army withdrew, he was quickly overthrown again. These years under Hungarian captivity pushed Vlad's character to a dark place. In 1456, he found an opportunity, returned to Wallachia, and overthrew his cousin to reclaim the throne. He sent a letter to Mehmed the Conqueror, pledging his loyalty. He even personally delivered his annual tribute and met with his childhood friend. During those days, it seemed their friendship was rekindled. But this friendship was short-lived. Vlad was a different man now, with a cold fury in his eyes and a deep hatred in his heart. The innocent friendships of his childhood and the rules of etiquette he learned at the Ottoman court were long forgotten. A prince no longer sat on the throne of Wallachia. A blood-fed executioner was emerging. First, he set his sights on the boyars, nobles he believed had betrayed his father. He invited them to a great banquet. In the middle of the feast, Vlad stood up. His voice was ice-cold. "You betrayed your father. You sold these lands to the enemy. Now you will pay the price for your treason." Suddenly, soldiers stormed the hall. The unarmed nobles were taken outside one by one. Then, the famous execution began. Each of them was impaled on thick stakes. Vlad watched, listening to their screams. But this was only the beginning. For Vlad, this was less of a punishment and more of a ceremony. The historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles writes that a peaceful smile would appear on Vlad's face as he narrated these scenes. It was as if he were not a prince, but an executioner delivering justice. He didn't stop there. He rounded up beggars, cripples, and homeless people, whom he called the burden of society. He gave them a feast. As these well-fed, well-clothed people looked at Vlad with gratitude, they were suddenly surrounded. A large wooden building had been prepared in advance. They were all herded inside, the doors were shut, and then it was set on fire. As the flames rose to the sky, Vlad sat on his horse, watching the blaze without moving. The historian Antonio Bonfini records Vlad turning to his soldiers afterward and saying, "There are no longer any beggars left in my country. Wallachia has been cleansed." From that moment on, the darkness within Vlad was unleashed. For him, ruling was not a matter of statecraft but a source of pleasure. The sound of people dying became music to his ears. Some sources say he wanted victims impaled in front of his dining table, so he could drink wine while looking at them. According to some legends, it's even said that he drank the blood of his enemies, believing it would give him power. And all this rage and brutality were directed most of all at the Turks. He harbored a deep hatred for the years he spent in the Ottoman palace, his father's forced loyalty, and his own childhood captivity. He now set his sights on the Ottomans, and this was the beginning of a bloody period in history that would cost thousands of lives. The year 1459 was a time when the Ottoman Empire was growing stronger in the Balkans. Vlad had grown tired of being an Ottoman vassal. He stopped sending the regular annual tribute. Not only that, he made a secret alliance with the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus. He then sent his raiders to the border. Ottoman villages were raided, and homes were set on fire. Women, children, and the elderly were all impaled on stakes. This was a challenge to Mehmed. In Istanbul, these reports arrived one after another. Mehmed the Conqueror had known Vlad since childhood. This old friend was challenging the Ottomans with his atrocities. Mehmed did not want to spill blood at first. He sent an embassy and asked Vlad to resume paying tribute and to come to Constantinople to explain his actions. When the envoys arrived in Wallachia, Vlad received them in a great hall. They appeared before him with their turbans on. Vlad asked, "Why don't you take off your turbans?" The envoys replied, "It is not our custom to take off our headgear. This is an honor bestowed upon us by the Ottoman Sultan." Vlad's eyes flashed with rage. "Is that so? Then let these turbans stay on your heads forever." He gave the order. Nails were driven into the envoys' heads, and they were all impaled. This event was even recorded in European chronicles as a challenge and an invitation to war. Mehmed the Conqueror's patience had run out. This was not just a rebellion, but an attack on the honor of the state. Mehmed began to gather his armies, and preparations for a march on Wallachia began. As Mehmed's army entered Wallachia, Vlad prepared for a final resistance. He resorted to the most brutal methods to stop the Ottoman army. All the wells in the villages were poisoned, fields were burned, and animals were killed. He gathered people with plague and leprosy and unleashed them on the Ottoman camps. It's no coincidence that chronicles refer to this period as the summer smelling of death. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad put on his armor and headed toward the Ottoman camp with his horse. The midnight raid began. Wallachian cavalry, like ghosts, infiltrated the Ottoman camp. Torches were thrown and tents were set on fire. The sleeping soldiers panicked and grabbed their weapons. Vlad's target was Mehmed the Conqueror's tent. However, the guards pushed him back. Ottoman chronicles write that Mehmed coolly rallied the soldiers. Toward dawn, the Wallachian army retreated, having suffered heavy losses. Mehmed was determined to get revenge. He marched with his army to Targovist. The city gates were open, but there was silence. When the Ottoman soldiers advanced, they saw more than 20,000 people impaled on stakes, spread over an area of about 3 miles, 5 kilometers, just outside the city. This sight was so horrifying that even some of the battle-hardened Ottoman soldiers couldn't hold back their tears. Mehmed the Conqueror watched this scene in silence from his horse for a long time. He then turned to those beside him and is said to have uttered these words, which went down in history. If a ruler can create such a scene, he has absolute authority over his people. It will not be easy to overthrow such an enemy from his throne. Mehmed overthrew Vlad and put his brother Radu on the throne. Vlad, in turn, fled to Hungary, where he was held in a castle dungeon by King Matthias for 12 years. However, when the Ottomans and Hungarians began to fight, Vlad reappeared on the scene. The Hungarians sent him to Wallachia once more because they thought Vlad was the best weapon against the Ottomans. But Vlad's second reign did not last long. Even the Wallachian people hated him. When he faced the Ottomans, there was no longer any trace of his former power. Mehmed the Conqueror assigned the legendary raider Mahalaglu Ali Bey to the task. Mahalaglu, with his 2,000 elite raiders, went after Vlad and finally captured him. Within a few months, Vlad's head was brought to Constantinople. His severed head was displayed on top of a stake for days as a warning. It was then buried somewhere in Constantinople. Today, the name Dracula lives on in popular culture as a vampire story. But the real story was that of a human being who had turned into a monster. Vlad Tepes went down in history as Vlad the Impaler. He instilled fear by impaling thousands of people. Even his own people called him the son of the devil. Perhaps this is why the legends still follow him. And some historians still say that Vlad's head is buried somewhere in Istanbul.